Welcome everybody who has already joined today. We are expecting to have about 60 to 70 people. Right now we are just 24, 25, but many people are coming in as we speak. I'm going to moderate a bit today, so I will pick up after the lecture by Professor Brandstedt in about 45 minutes from now. And yeah, my name is Giovanni. You received some communication also from me, besides other people in our PhilETAS group. We are very excited that this is starting today. We are very happy to have Professor Brandstedt as the first speaker. So just a couple of things. We are going to record this, and then we will put it for future access on the YouTube channel of ITAS, our institute here, where we are streaming from. And so we ask everybody to turn off the camera when Professor Brandstedt starts the lecture, and mute yourself, as you already know. Yeah, you know, you're skilled academics doing these kind of things. And then during the discussion, maybe then you can turn on the camera and communicate, etc. I will tell you later what the procedure later will be for the Q&A discussion. Now I pass it on to the head of our PhilETAS group, Professor Hillerbrand, who is going to tell you something about the reasons for creating these lecture series now, and then some introduction about Professor Brandstedt as well. So thank you, and I see you later.
Yeah, thanks, Giovanni, and also very welcome from my side. Well, Giovanni had to do the practicalities, and he will do them later again. I have the pleasure to introduce you to the content of this lecture series. I'm Raffaella Hillerbrand. Giovanni already told you I'm professor for philosophy of engineering, science and technology here at ITAS, and head of the research group PhilETAS, philosophy of engineering, technology, assessment and science, who is organizing this event. And that is the first point I want to make. I really want to thank the people who organized this event. My special thanks goes to all the postdocs in our group. A lot of them you already see here with our uniform background. But a very special thanks goes to Giovanni Frigo for his ideas, his time, and his energy for setting this up. Thanks a lot, Giovanni. I'm sure we all appreciate this in the coming months and already today. For the organization and setting up this online event, you all know it can be difficult. I want to thank Maike Hebig. I've seen her on the list of participants from ITAS. Thanks a lot, Maike. And for the financing, I want to thank the Helmholtz Research Association. Content-wise, energy ethics. Well, the need to include ethical aspects into reasoning about the usage of energy services, distribution of energy, electricity, and storage recently became once again very clear when the Russian war in Ukraine impacted the gas supply in Europe. Well, still today, but particularly for a very long time in the 20th centuries, energy was seen mainly as a topic for the sciences, for the engineering. This has changed already in the 1960s with the discussions on the civil use of the nuclear power. Discussions on how to share the risks of energy technologies in a fair way, how to deal with aspects of intergeneral justice already emerged there. And they emerged again on the agenda when sustainability, in particular climate change, made it to the political agenda. And while, that's very roughly speaking, while the social sciences were in this debate and played a larger and larger role in the 1960s, the humanities, in particular philosophy and ethics, only joined much later. So I think now we have this young field of energy ethics, an interdisciplinary field. And I still think that the contributions from philosophy and ethics are emerging here. And that is where we are now, and where we already were a few years back. And a bit more than a year ago, at the end of 2021, if I recall correctly, PhilETAS, also under the organization of the postdocs, and particularly Giovanni and others, organized the first workshop on energy ethics to bring together philosophers, social scientists, and to a lesser extent, engineers, to reflect on the ethical aspects of energy. And as you all know, these go far beyond a fair distribution of risks or energy resources. And that is where this lecture series emerged from. And that is also setting the goal for this lectures. We want to highlight ongoing endeavors to engage crucial energy issues from the perspectives of ethical reasoning and reflection. And we and I are very happy to start today's lecture series with Professor Dr. Eric Brandstedt in Germany, so you get the full title, and with his focus on climate change. Eric is a senior lecturer in human rights studies and associate professor in philosophy at Lund University in Sweden. Eric's research concerns the normative dimensions of climate change. Just to give you two examples, questions like what is a fair distribution of the costs and benefits of dealing with climate change, or aspects of intergenerational justice. Eric also has a general interest in political moral philosophy, and also just to give you two bits what he's working on and what he published on. This is John Rawls' theories and methods, reflective equilibrium, and as a second example, the concept of human rights in international politics. Eric has a long-standing record in research centered around energy ethics. In 2013, he published his PhD thesis with the title, The Construction of a Sustainable Development in Times of Climate Change. That's 10 years ago. And since then, he has not only published a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles, what philosophers and academics do, but he also published a range of public outreach articles, contributed, for example, on blogs of the United Nations on all topics which are centered on energy ethics. And I picked just a few publications, recent ones, which I think when I mention the title, give you an insight into his research portfolio. In 2019, he published in the Journal of Applied Philosophy an article with the title Towards a Theory of Pure Procedural Climate Justice. In 2021, he published an article in the Journal of Political Philosophy, Engaged Climate Ethics. And his latest paper, published only this year, last year, sorry, I'm still in 22, has the title When Energy Justice is Contested, a systematic review of a decade of research in Sweden's conflicted energy landscape. And this last publication links to an interdisciplinary research project that he is currently heading together with scholars from sustainability science and human ecology. The project is called JET, Just Energy Transitions, and it's funded by the Swedish Energy Agency. And if you don't hear about this in your talk, I very much look forward to learn more about this project, because it's also a approach we at PhilETAS and also at ITAS foster to closely engage with the engineering and the scientists on these topics. So you all know the energy sector has a major impact on climate. It accounts globally, particularly in Europe and in Germany, with regional variations, for about 2/3 of the harmful greenhouse gas emissions. So we are really very happy to start this lecture series with not only Eric, but also with a talk on climate leadership. So the floor is yours. I really look forward to the talk on the contested meaning of climate leadership.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, for that introduction. And thanks to you and Giovanni and Aiki and the others for inviting me. And yeah, it's really an honor to be the first presenter of this series. Now I'm just going to set up my presentation here. Right.
Good.
So, can you see that all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yes. So this is part of the project that Rafaela mentioned, Just Energy Transitions, and co-authored with my colleagues from that project, Vasna Ramazar, Henry Bush, and Dominic Arsenault. Okay. So let me begin by explaining this background picture here. It's of a pilot plant for production of fossil-free steel with use of hydrogen, which is located in the north of Sweden. So this project has been used to substantiate a claim to climate leadership that Swedish politicians and businesses have made in recent years. But it's also been criticized for being unrealistic and blown out of proportion. Climate leadership claims are increasingly common, both in scholarly discourse and public discourse. And roughly what is meant is that affluent countries, as well as individuals and businesses, have a responsibility to lead the transition to a low carbon future. And not only in the sense that they should do more, but also that they should act first, early. Often this is a self-proclaimed ambition, but it's also an ideal that activists use to push others to raise their ambitions. But then what it means in more concrete terms is rather unclear. It has been interpreted as requiring everything from rapid development of renewable energy to investments in nuclear energy to paying developing countries to implement green technologies and even to invest in, relatively speaking, clean fossil fuel infrastructure. But even if it's not fully clear what is meant by these claims, they are still widely criticized. So in scholarly contributions, it has been argued, for example, that such claims are superficial and self-defeating. And in public debate, ambitions set by claims to climate leadership are criticized as morally problematic or hypocritical. And particular proposals under this umbrella have been seen as just rhetoric or as attempts to evade responsibility and delay necessary changes. The grounds for justifiably calling someone or oneself a climate leader are poorly understood. In this paper, we propose a so-called ameliorative analysis of the concept of climate leadership. We propose that the meaning of the concept should be specified through an analysis of what legitimate political function it has. So the relevant question is, what kind of climate leadership do we need to further a just transition to a low carbon future? The concept of climate leadership functions as a tool for breaking the passiveness that pertains to climate politics and for creating momentum for change. And we argue that being clear about this political role opens up for ideology critique of some objectionable ends to which climate leadership have been put, such as for greenwashing, virtue signaling, and evading responsibility. So we use the method that Sally Haslanger has called ameliorative analysis. This is a kind of conceptual analysis, but unlike traditional conceptual analysis, the aim is not to clarify the meaning of existing common sense concepts. Rather, it is to improve or revise concepts with the ambition of furthering social change. So the point is clarifying how a concept should be used. The reason that the aim is revisionary is that common sense understandings of concepts are infused with ideological meaning, such that using them comes with a risk of perpetuating injustices. This is what Haslanger argues, and we agree with that. So there is really no way around engaging in a discussion about what are the legitimate political ends of for using this concept. And this applies to the concepts that Haslanger analyzes, such as race and gender, but as much to the concept that we focus on here, climate leadership. Also, that is infused with ideological meaning and is essentially contestable. Okay, so we'll take the following steps in the paper that this presentation is based on. We analyze existing literature and public debate around climate leadership. We identify ambiguities and contested meanings, and propose a morally justified function for the concept of climate leadership, and engage in ideology critique. Okay, so let's begin with the first step and look at the existing literature on climate leadership. So this concept has mainly been used in two contexts. First, in political science literature, where it's used to analyze international relations around climate change negotiations. The most common application has been to highlight the EU as a climate leader, but it has also been used to refer to ambitious domestic policies and initiatives of countries such as Sweden and Germany. Then there is also a more discourse analytic literature that studies the phenomenon of leadership claims and evaluates them critically. There are few clear definitions of the concept in this literature, but that of Crowley and Nakamura that I cite here can be said to reflect a common understanding, I think. So they define climate leadership as taking while encouraging and assisting others to take effective climate actions to reduce emissions and to adapt to climate change, both domestically and within the region. The focus in this literature is on identifying strategies used by actors to push for more ambitious climate action. So these four ideal types or modes of climate leadership are often used in those analyses. Sometimes different names are used for them. The first two, structural and diplomatic leadership modes, focus on actions taken in a negotiation situation. The first on actions of group agents, such as the EU or individual countries, and the second more on individual negotiators. Structural leadership is tied to both economic power, but also other kinds of clout, such as moral clout you can get from being particularly exposed to the problem or having low levels of emissions. And a typical example of how it's exercised is when the EU conditionalized its emission reductions on others taking on similarly ambitious commitments, that they would raise their ambitions if others also raised theirs. Intellectual leadership comes through forming and articulating ideas and knowledge that can be used to further climate action. And then the fourth mode is exemplary leadership, which refers to leading by example, taking on ambitious domestic actions unilaterally. Okay. So the conceptions of climate leadership put forward here in this literature are ambiguous in some respects, which make claims to climate leadership vague. It is, for example, often unclear what distinguishes leadership from sheer exercises of power. This is particularly problematic for the structural and diplomatic notions of climate leadership, as some powerful countries have steered the international climate negotiations towards their interests, but what is not clearly in the interests of all. This kind of ambiguity is arguably also relevant for exemplary leadership, in that some climate actions can be suspected of being driven largely by geopolitics and power play, rather than by what is in the common interest. Another ambiguity is to what extent actions and ends, the actions and ends of declared climate leaders are sufficiently responsive to the different circumstances that other agents face. So some actors, for example, push for radical changes, but it's unclear whether that in itself makes them climate leaders. A related set of ambiguities has to do with the conditions for following the path set by so-called leaders. We shall later argue, or shall later make the point that what makes someone a climate leader is not just that they take ambitious actions, but rather that they set out a particular path that others can follow. But it's often unclear whether the path set out by ambitious actors is one that others can and also should follow for an effective global response to climate change. Okay, that about the ambiguity of the concept. Now to its contested nature. So it's been criticized in scholarly literature to some extent. I should give one example here of a particularly clear critique of the concept of climate leadership from a paper by Rasmus Karlsson and Jonathan Simons. They focus on exemplary leadership and argue that progress towards a renewable small-scale energy future in environmentally conscious countries such as Germany and Sweden may take the world as a whole further away from climate stability by reducing the political pressure to finance breakthrough innovation. And climate leadership requires that technologically and capable environmentally concerned states formulate policies that seek to address the energy challenges of the world as a whole. What they are doing is that they lift issues of effectiveness and scale as problems for some of the existing leadership strategies. And they argue that wealthy countries right now do not show climate leadership by investing in renewable energy technologies deployed domestically, since this will do little to further the overall goal of the decarbonization globally. This line of argument can of course be disputed both empirically and normatively, but I just want to mention it now as an example of how the concept is contested. And move on to public discourse. So in public debate, claims to climate leadership are widely contested. The argument is often that there is something hypocritical about them. So one cannot be a climate leader if one has one foot still in the fossil fuel world. And climate leaders must also be, to a greater extent, responsive to the necessary scale and urgency of the changes that are required. One example of this kind of critique is against Canada's claimed leadership under Justin Trudeau. This has been criticized as hypocritical since they have no plans of ceasing the production of oil from the tar sands, although they implement ambitious climate policies at the same time. A similar challenge and critique is now put against Germany. It is argued to fail to live up to its claimed climate leadership position as it continues to invest in coal production. For example, now in the battle over literatur. Also, the EU and their claim to climate leadership has been challenged. It has, for example, been argued that it's incremental as opposed to transformational, and that they bank on technological innovations that do not yet exist, such as carbon capture and storage and geoengineering, and that they still subsidize fossil fuel industry. Also, non-governmental actors who claim leadership in this context have been criticized. A recent example is that of Jeff Bezos, the richest person in the world. He recently made a huge $10 billion climate pledge to set up an Earth Fund to fund transformational change. At the same time, his companies, Amazon and Blue Origin, and so on, emit huge amounts of carbon dioxide, and he even sponsors climate-denying think tanks, which has led some to criticize him for being hypocritical. A more generalized challenge against all world leaders was memorably put forward by Greta in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow. So she said, build back better, blah, 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 green economy, blah, 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 net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Calling out the sheep talk of the so-called leaders. So that's one typical challenge against leadership. But interestingly, climate leadership is also criticized as hypocritical and morally unjustified from the other side, so to speak, by those who argue that the current levels of ambition is too high. So in the backlash against climate politics that we have seen in recent years, with the yellow vest being a typical example of this, a common argument there is that we, that is countries such as France, UK, Sweden, Germany, shouldn't pretend to be the savior of the world. It matters more what others do, almost always pointing to China. So this is an implicit challenge against an imagined or claimed leadership and against ambitious climate policies. Okay. So summing up a bit what I've said, climate leadership is mostly used to refer to ambitious affluent countries or groups of countries in international climate negotiations. It is ambiguous on what grounds it is ascribed or asserted beyond some level of ambition, and claims to climate leadership are controversial in both scholarly and public discourse. So now I want to focus on the second and third step of the analysis, that is, try to formulate a legitimate political role for the concept of climate leadership and develop an improved version. So the basic problem which climate leadership is responding to, we argue, is the lack of sufficiently ambitious climate action. So not enough is done. There is an ambition gap, which leads to an emission gap between what is currently done and what must be done in order to successfully combat climate change. Henry Shue made this argument, for example, over 10 years ago, urging rich countries to face the reality of climate change and get going to break the impasse. So something must be done by someone, and very likely rich countries, in order to achieve some kind of change of the status quo. But this is rather abstract and non-committal. So now I want to move on to fill out some more details and make it a bit more refined, this concept. So what we propose is that it be analyzed as a maxim or an action principle. So climate leadership consists of an action, a description of the circumstances under which it is to be done, and the end or purpose to be achieved by the action. So it's not, it doesn't apply to actions alone, such as plans, initiatives, policies, but rather to a more principled formulation in which the action is situated in a particular circumstance and supplemented with an intention or motive. And this means that it's not possible to claim climate leadership on the basis of simply having low levels of CO2 emissions, for example. There is something else that is required. Okay, so let me now move on to develop this analysis a bit, focusing first on the second part, aiming to provide a richer description of the circumstances of climate leadership. So climate change is a collective action problem where everyone must act. There is a need for coordination, and coordination is a means to more efficient action, more effective action, and more just action. And since time is running out, the demand for coordination is increasingly pressing. There is general reluctance to be a first mover or carry upfront costs. There's limited room for international coordination, as we know from the failed efforts of arriving at something more ambitious than the Paris Agreement. But at the same time, the situation is far from a deadlocked situation. There are lots of climate action and related actions that take place in various levels by various agents and collective agents all over the world. And there are plenty of ambitious plans and generally good understanding of the problem and the stakes. And finally, climate justice is an imperative. And we know that climate policies raise perceived injustices, at least. So that's the problem described in general terms. Now, depending on how the situation is described in more detail, climate leadership can be understood to play different roles. So I'll present three different understandings of the situation with three different functions for the concept to play. So the first way of understanding the situation is as a deadlocked situation, general paralysis, a situation similar to those in which the bystander effect occurs. So no one does anything, but just looks around and hopes that someone else will act. In such a situation, the need for leadership is arguably just for someone to step forward and break the ice, break the passivity that exists, and do something quite irrespective of what they do. And another reason for acting in such a situation, for unilateral actions in such a situation, is to signal one's willingness to cooperate. Okay, but that's not really the situation that we are in. As I already said, lots of things are going on. So the problem is rather that not enough is done. and perhaps not the right actions are taken. There is a need to raise ambitions and for someone to show how this can be done. Thus, the need for leadership is more a need for something like a courageous guide who's willing to act first under uncertainty and show others how obstacles can be overcome and uncertainty reduced, such that others can and will follow. So it's like someone blazing a trail in the jungle. So. Then, thirdly, one might also describe the situation as one of generalized non-compliance with principles of climate justice. This is how many climate ethicists have analyzed it. So more or less everyone fails to live up to their climate responsibilities. And the point of leadership is to push others to do what they have moral reasons to do. But we argue that this third description is somewhat misleading and not the most productive way of describing the conditions for climate leadership. It is true that an important function of climate leadership is to push others to do what they should do, but that's not all of it. Okay, so we'll focus on the second formulation of the situation here. Now, another thing that must be noted is, of course, that there is a wide variety of different agents. There are individuals, businesses, civil society, NGOs, governments, international organizations, and probably other kinds of agents as well. And they face very different circumstances. Some are rich, others are poor, have different levels of technological advancement, different natural conditions for developing clean energy, for example, good rivers for hydropower, wind and shallow oceans for offshore wind power, forest reserves that can be used for bioenergy, and so on. There are also different social and political conditions, different levels of democracy, social trust, inequality. And it's interesting to note that the concept of climate leadership has been almost exclusively applied to affluent countries and organizations, such as what I mentioned, Sweden, Germany, the EU. And this seems to be somewhat unfortunate because there is a need for something like universal fellowship, at least. And there is a risk of being biased here in this discussion and of the concept being Eurocentric. So it's important to be clear about the circumstances which obtain in applying the concept of climate leadership, and also to differentiate and compare the circumstances of the claimed leader from those of possible followers. Okay, now moving on to the ends of climate leadership. So we argue that the ultimate aim has to be a just, timely, effective global transition to a low carbon future. This ultimate aim can, however, be pursued together with various complementary secondary aims. So one set of secondary aims is moral secondary aims. A reason for acting towards this ultimate aim can be that it's a way of minimizing harms related to climate change, harm reduction. And perhaps together with the fact that one has the capacity to act. Another reason is that one is aiming to change the political situation such that a fair, collectively coordinated response becomes more likely. Yet another moral reason is wanting to do the right thing and to distance oneself from the disgraceful paralysis and lack of ambition that currently exists. Then there are also non-moral reasons for being a climate leader, such as wanting to increase one's competitive advantage in an emerging market, to save costs, to improve one's reputation, and so on. Okay. Now, the third component of the analysis. We have talked about now the ends and the circumstances, and now the first part, which is the acts of climate leadership. So here's a list of possible actions that would fall under the umbrella of climate leadership acts. Climate actions such as mitigation, diplomatic actions such as sanctions, research and development, enabling actions that are indirectly related to climate actions, addressing particular obstacles to the transition, divestment from the fossil fuel economy, and so on. Okay, so with these three analytic components, let me now pull them together and present a definition. So we propose that climate leadership should be understood as an agent is a climate leader if and only if they take particularly effective and ambitious actions that further the collective project of a just and timely transition to a low-carbon future. There's a need for more ambition, but not just any kind of ambition. It must be responsive to climate change being a collective action problem, and therefore developed against a background of kind of shared understanding of the problem. And the ambitious actions taken by a climate leader must also set out a path that others can follow, and one that is responsive to or addresses particular obstacles that others face in relation to the collective problem. This concept, we believe, has an important role to play in climate politics, in highlighting some particularly important actions in the context that I described, and pointing out role models that others can follow in a situation of factual and moral uncertainty and lots of possibilities. Okay, but it's also climate leadership is also something that can be misused or abused. So let me finally elaborate a bit on the meaning of this concept by then engaging in the ideology critique that I said was part of the ameliorative analysis. So vague and ambiguous concepts are infused with ideological meaning. Climate leadership is not a common sense concept, but it's an ambiguous and vague concept that also has a very positive value, the status attached to it. It means doing the right things, being one of the good guys. So this makes it open to being exploited or co-opted for other ends, and even used to directly counteract climate action. I should also finally note that there is another kind of risk, namely that climate leadership is set up as some kind of moral utopia, which for that reason failed to play a meaningful role. I'll come back to that soon. But okay, so let me say something about this perverted senses of climate leadership. So the clearest examples are when it's used to directly counteract the overall aim of the ultimate aim. So when climate leadership claims fail in this way, one may describe them as greenwashing. And some of the examples that I mentioned earlier, before here, are perhaps examples of that. So pretending that something is showing leadership and furthering this morally justified end, while actually being just a smokescreen, covering up what is basically business as usual. In other instances, the failure is not that nothing is done, but that what is done is too little to warrant the claim, with the effect that the claim is puffed up and misleading. So such claims direct attention away from meaningful, effective, and ambitious climate action. This can also be described as greenwashing, but also as virtue signaling, perhaps. And another kind of failure is when leadership is claimed in ways which predictably lead to a deflection of responsibility, such as in some arguments where the claim is that economic rationality favors paying others in developing countries to change while remaining uncommitted to make any substantial changes oneself. And finally, another kind of failure is when climate leadership is used to legitimize morally unacceptable compromises, such as when the green agenda is used to suppress indigenous people who are claimed to stand in the way of clean energy infrastructure. The degree of failure has partly to do with what end it is put to, if it is to cover up climate injustices or delay necessary changes, and also the degree to which it fails to respond to the collective nature of the problem. If it's an exercise of power to influence others, or an attempt to clear one's own conscience while instead of helping others to take effective steps. And then finally, the final slide. I want to note also something about the other side, that the concept can also be, arguably, can also be misused in another way, namely by setting up an impossibly demanding ideal. So in some critiques of claimed leadership, what is asked for seem to be an uncompromising moral purity, where it's hypocritical to have any part in the fossil fuel economy. This may be problematic in that it reduces the possible role that climate leadership can play in real politics, because it's almost impossible to not, or to distance oneself completely from the fossil fuel economy is very difficult, to say the least. So here, I think that it's more constructive to follow the lead that is pointed out by non-ideal climate justice theory, such as Keynes and others, who point to the need for leaders to engage in difficult moral compromising. And that is probably what must be addressed here. All right, so let me summarize quickly. Climate leadership means taking particularly effective and ambitious actions that further a collective project of a just and timely transition to a low carbon future. Not being clear about this important political role of the concept opens up for it being abused or misused. And in order to further develop it, what it means, there is a need to consider some difficult moral trade-offs. Okay, that was it. Thank you for listening to that. Look forward to your Q&A comments.
Very good. Yes, enjoy some hands clapping for you. Also from my side.